Welcome back to Noble Green Wine School, and this week we're in central Italy, and heading up from the south the landscape is generally more mountainous and cooler than the south, less olive trees, more pasture, and that's reflected in the wines. Less alcohol, arguably more refinement, or at least more of a medium-bodied, balanced style of wine with a more savoury edge than overtly fruit-driven. Kicking off in Abruzzo, for the most part this is one variety country, namely Montepulciano. The DOC is, for the whole region, is Montepulciano d'Abruzzo, and for whites Trebbiano d'Abruzzo, both from Trebbiano Toscano, named for Tuscany, and Trebbiano Abruzzese from this region. Another speciality here is Cresolo de Bruzzo. Now this isn't named for the grape variety, it's a style. It's made from Montepulciano, and depending on your point of view it's either a dark rosé or a light red. The Montepulciano is macerated for 8 to 10 hours to draw out a reasonable amount of colour. It's darker than any rosé, but not quite as dark as the Cresolo de Vittorio we tried in Sicily. That was really a light red. There's small amounts of other varieties here as well, Sangiovese for reds, Pecorino and Pastorina for whites, and a myriad of others, including the international varieties. Again, there's quite a few plantations of those that have cropped up over the last 20-30 years. Most of the production here is cooperatives, making about 80% of the wines, and they're usually solid, if not often top draw in terms of quality wines. Montepulciano is one of those great varieties that can make anything from light and fruity to brooding, dark, oak-aged, heavy wines that are capable of aging. Unusually, even when it is aged and it takes on those tertiary, gamey, leathery aromas and flavours with age that all red wines take on to a greater or lesser extent, it holds on to its primary fruitiness for quite a lot longer. So you can get quite a lot of fruit and these sort of gamey flavours together in an aged Montepulciano, which can be quite interesting. It can gain complexity with age, but it doesn't need to. Unlike some wines that we've seen like Taurasi, or we'll come on to Brunello, Barolo in particular, they really need at least a few years to settle down before they're even really drinkable. Montepulciano is all about instant gratification for me. So we'll try the Montepulciano d'Abruzzo a little bit later on, even though we're looking at the area now, because I want to actually taste it side by side with the Sangiovese based wine from Vino Nobile di Montepulciano, which is a different thing altogether. There are several sub-regions within Abruzzo, some such as Contraguerra. They allow the international varieties within the DOC rules, for better or worse, but for the most part the distinction between the various DOCs is negligible, and certainly more detailed than we're looking at today. So moving on to Lazio, this is around the capital Rome, on the other side of the Italian peninsula. It's an area of huge potential, but for me largely unrealised. It's a very good grape growing area. It has a moderate climate, great geology, some volcanic sites, some areas of calcareous clay. Much of the focus really though has been on quantity in favour of quality. It's a great wine growing area. It has the right geology. There's patches of volcanic areas, patches with calcareous clay, but most of the focus has been on quantity at the expense of quality. 3/4 white wine production, mostly based on the Malvasia family of grapes, as well as Trebbiano Giallo. It's mainly grown in Orvieto, which is a region that straddles both Lazio and Umbria to the north, although much more of it is in Umbria, as we'll come to see. Orvieto is usually quite a neutral table wine, but it can have some character and age for a few years as well. It can be a good wine, but not quite at the top level of Italian whites. Trebbiano Toscano is a grape that's found across the region, but also in the rather curiously named Est DOC. Est di Montefisacone, to give it its full name. For reds, Aleatico, Sangiovese, Montepulciano and the Cesanese family of grapes make up most of the balance of largely unremarkable wines. Le Marche is another area where the historic quality of its wines don't quite match its current status. In pre-Roman times it was occupied by the Etruscans, who were eventually subsumed into the Roman Empire, but they had great winemaking knowledge, they were great viticulturalists, and by 301 AD, the Edict of Diocletian, who was the emperor at the time, this was basically a text that fixed prices across the empire in order to maintain economic stability. And the wines of Picenum, as it was known then, they were the most expensive in the empire, so clearly the quality was the best that was available at the time. For reds, the two main grape varieties here are Montepulciano and Sangiovese, those two grapes that we keep finding across central Italy. And this constitutes the DOC Rosso Piceno, which is named for the Picenum tribe. So we can see there is a clear line from ancient times right the way through to the present day of quality wine being produced here, although it's still not at the top level. There's still some good wines here. Vernaccia Nera is used to make a curiosity, a sweet sparkling wine, great with chocolate desserts, but a bit of a speciality, now declining in popularity. Lacrima is the local red grape of interest. This makes Lacrima de Mora d'Alba, which is usually a very expressive, fruity and floral red wine. The grape itself nearly died out, as it didn't really take to American rootstocks. It's also a bit prone to disease. The name actually comes from tears, lacrima, because the grapes are prone to splitting and dripping juice, but that also attracts pests and diseases, which is not great. But it's an interesting survivor for me. For whites, the main grapes are Pesarina, Bicame, Verdicchio, another great grape variety capable of producing some really interesting wines. Verdicchio di Caselli di Jesi is a DOCG, which I'm sure you've heard of. It's quite a famous Italian white wine, one of their top white wines. Pecorino is another grape that I find really interesting. I think it actually could even overtake Verdicchio in terms of quality. The actual name, it's nothing to do with pecorino cheese, which is made from sheep's cheese. It actually refers to the shape of the grapes. They tend to sort of hang in the shape a bit like a sheep's head, so that's why there's that connection to pecorino cheese. They're not actually related in any way. Pecorino usually has really good acidity, lovely minerality, and a lovely floral element as well, so we'll try that now. The first thing that leaps out for me is a little bit of melon, a little bit of honeysuckle. There's quite a lot of fruit there, but it's not overtly fruity, it's not jammy or confected in any way. And again, lots of that melon fruit, a little bit of pineapple. It's very, very ripe, but it's held really well together with the acidity and a little bit of herbaceousness on the finish. It's quite a well-balanced wine. It's not just about the fruit. There's quite a lot going on there. You've got the fruitiness, herbaceousness, and that lovely acidity sort of holding it all together. It would be a great aperitif wine, but really this is superb with food, particularly with quite a light lunchtime creamy pasta dish, particularly with some mushrooms or something in there. That would be really lovely. Landlocked between Lazio and Marche is Umbria. Things get a little bit more interesting here. The climate is continental, hot summers, cold winters, and the altitude of most of the vineyards is quite high, which tempers the extremes of heat in the summer. The inland series of valleys that make up much of Umbria's vineyards are very like Tuscany, sort of rolling hills, very green, very verdant. The dominant grape here is Grechetto di Orvieto, because Orvieto accounts for about 80% of the production here. It's the dominant grape there, along with Trebbiano. Grechetto di Todi is also widely grown, but it's not part of a family of grapes like Malvasia. It just has the same name, which really doesn't help in getting to understand the different grapes of Italy. Some of them are families, some of them just happen to have the same name. Very confusing, I know, but that's the Italians for you. Orvieto can be a bit varied. I mean, it's never bad. It can be just sort of light and neutral, a nice table wine. At the top level, it can be very, very good indeed, capable of aging a few years and taking on a little bit more minerality. It can be a very good wine, but in general, particularly what we see over here, is a bit uninspiring. For reds, although some superb Sangiovese is grown here, the recent success is Sagrantino, with a DOCG for Sagrantino di Montefalco. This grape has quite low yields, quite careful handling, because it has very high tannins. It has about twice as many tannins as Nebbiolo or Cabernet Sauvignon, which are quite tannic themselves. As a result of this, the DOCG wines for the Sagrantino di Montefalco need 37 months aging, 12 of which have to be in oak, and that is simply to allow these tannins to integrate the fruit character of the wine. It's usually picked quite late as well in order to get that full development of the fruit flavours. Otherwise, you'd end up with an unbalanced wine with loads of tannins and no body, which is never going to develop into anything interesting. A way into this wine is actually the Rosso di Montefalco, which is mainly Sangiovese with about 10 to 15% of the Sagrantino blended in, so you're getting a flavour of it without having to age it for decades before it's drinkable. So it's an interesting way into this interesting grape variety. Moving on next to Tuscany. Now this is the spiritual heart of Italy, and this is definitively Sangiovese country. There are three principal Sangiovese areas: Chianti, Vino Nobile de Montepulciano, and Brunello de Montalcino, all of which give slightly different expressions of this grape. Chianti is obviously the most famous region. It's the one everyone's heard of. It's like Bordeaux is to France. It's quite a big area. There are pockets of vineyards dotted all around between the Renaissance cities of Florence and Siena, and a lot of them are really, really tiny ones, and some are quite large. Chianti GOCG is the main appellation, which covers most of the area. There are also a small group of Colli Chiantis, which are of local interest. There's basically all the hills around the outside of Florence and some around Siena. You don't really see them much in the UK, but these are small little pockets The largest sub-region that you're probably familiar with is Chianti Rufina. This is mostly to the east of Florence, and this is slightly warmer, so the wines tend to be a little bit more structured, a little higher in alcohol, a little more body, and they're just slightly different character from the other Chiantis from further north or in the cooler regions. Chianti Classico is at the heart of Chianti. It's the most typical of the Chianti style. It requires a minimum 80% Sangiovese, all the other appellations are 70%. The balance is made up mainly with Canaiolo and Colorino. They also allow in some of them a little bit of Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, that is permitted, but it tends to be quite minimal amounts. Within Chianti Classico there are 3 tiers: Chianti Classico, Reserva and Gran Selezione. For this last group, the rules are about to change, and there are 11 villages that are going to be allowed to append their names to the Gran Selezione Chianti Classico, indicating a really more specific geographical area, actually modelled slightly more on the French system of naming it after the village. I think would be useful for the consumer because you're going to get a bit more interest and knowledge of where this is from, because Chianti is quite a big area. These are going to be called UGAs, which is basically geographically named areas. In the past, Chianti did have a bit of a poor reputation. There was a lot of thin, uninspiring wine up to the sort of 90s and 2000s. A lot of it appeared in, I don't know if you remember those sort of rounder shaped bottles with a sort of wicker work on the bottom. Most of this was partly due to different clones of Chianti being planted in the wrong place. As I've mentioned before, Sangiovese is a family of grapes, and a lot of them have developed to really suit that area just through the people selecting grapes that grew better and taking cuttings. That's how you find this natural, if slightly man-made, selection of grape varieties suiting a certain area, and they sort of develop into their own different clones. Sometimes things were replanted with clones just from the local co-op, weren't necessarily the right ones for the area, and with better knowledge of which clones work where, you're getting ones in the cooler areas that ripen better, and overall the quality of Chianti these days is pretty uniform. Even at the cheapest level you can find a wine that's perfectly light and drinkable. The top level, obviously, they're some of the best wines in the world. The next region to look at is Vino Nobile di Montepulciano. It's further south, around the village of Montepulciano. Importantly, this is the village of Montepulciano, nothing to do with Montepulciano the grape, although that is widely grown further south and east of here. And that causes a lot of confusion because you've got Montepulciano di Bruzzo and Nobile di Montepulciano, which are quite different wines. In this instance, it has to be at least 70% Sangiovese, but the example we have here is a Reserva, so at least 80%, with a little Canaiolo added, so very much the traditional blend. So before we go any further, if we taste these wines side by side, starting off with the Montepulciano di Bruzzo, the grape Montepulciano. Lovely medium colour, 2 years old, so not particularly old, you've still got lots of that primary fruit there. Lovely vibrancy of fruit, plums, damsons, a little bit of strawberry actually, a little bit of strawberry creaminess on the finish. A little bit of tannins, I mean they are there, it's a great food wine. Could drink it on its own, but really this is sort of pizza, pasta sort of a wine. Really, really great example of what it is at a modest price. Moving on to the Nobile di Montepulciano, Reserva. This is 8 years old. So different grape, mainly Sangiovese with a little bit of Canaiolo. They don't often tell you exact proportions of which are which. Sometimes on California labels you'll see 2% of this, 5% of that. Here they're a bit more vague about it, but I suspect it's probably about 10% Canaiolo. But this really for me is all about Sangiovese. This is a very typical mid-Tuscan wine. There's already a lot more development on the nose. There's plenty of fruit there still, but there's a lot more smokiness, earthiness, some of those tertiary aromas coming through, a little bit of gaminess. And on the palate, a little bit more tannins. Obviously some of the tannins will have been shed out in its time in barrel and in bottle, so the tannins have softened, but they're still there. Very much in balance with the fruit. This is a lovely wine. It's one I could spend a whole evening on and let it. I've opened this about an hour before we started, just to let it breathe a little bit. It should give instant pleasure when you open it, but often wines benefit from a little bit of air getting into them. Great food wine. There's a bistecca fiorentina, which is a sort of local delicacy, which is a steak cooked on the char grill. Absolutely enormous. I don't know what size animals they come from, but one will easily go between 4 people. It would be absolutely perfect with that. It's a real red meat sort of a wine, but a lot of depth and complexity as well. It's not a full-on Aussie Shiraz. This is a very subtle wine. I hope you've had a good flavour of Central Italy's wines, and you want to start looking a bit further afield at some of the more obscure regions I've touched on. And next time we're heading north into northeast Italy and Veneto and beyond. Thank you.